Evening. On behalf of the organizing committee of the Robert L. Hess Scholar in Residence Program, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this Robert L. Hess Memorial Lecture. I would like to greet Mrs. Hess, who is here with us. She has been an active, very active member in the planning and presentation of these events for the, must be 25 years that we've been doing them. Since Vartan Gregorian in 1991, was it? 1992? Maybe I don't have the dates right. 92? The original plan was to have one every year, but somehow or other we seem to have one every other year. Now, I don't know what that has to do with, but I was discussing this with our president earlier, and we came to the conclusion that it has to do with budget cuts in Albany, even though the funds that support this wonderful program come entirely from a very generously funded endowment that was put in place by the family and friends of the late president of Brooklyn College. I'm going to tell you more about him later when we get across the street, but let me just say now that the planning and presentation of this series is one of the most interesting things that we do. Somehow this landed in the lap of the Wolf Institute. We do a lot of other things, and they're all really interesting, but none of them is quite as absorbing as this. Partly because it's a little bigger and more complicated, and partly because it puts us in touch with the very wide and complex richness of the Brooklyn College faculty and student body, which I have always had a great admiration for, especially since they fired me back in 1970, and I went to work at a state college in New Jersey, where everybody seemed to be sound asleep. And when I came back here, I felt like I was at Cambridge, or possibly New Haven, I'm not sure which, but anyway, and I have never really lost that sense that someone has who has been saved from the burning. You know, it's a wonderful place and a wonderful faculty, and this is an amazing program. You'll hear more about it later. This is, of course, a presidential initiative, and the Office of the President has been very hospitable to us. The President has made her staff and her resources available to us whenever we needed them, and she has promised she's going to speak to you now, and we have been negotiating as to whether it shall, this is, again, a budget crisis, whether it shall be 2 sentences or 3. I asked for 3, and she promised 3, but then she said 2, but we don't know. Sometimes she gets carried away, and she might talk for a little while. It's a great pleasure to give you the president of Brooklyn College, Karen Ghoul.
I promise I will not get carried away. And it's 3 sentences. So I am happy, I'm delighted to welcome everyone, students, faculty, staff, deans, administrators, and all sorts of people. But most importantly, the very special people in the room, which are our honored guest, Professor Frank and Fran Hess, and her friends. And Fran has been a very staunch supporter of this initiative for a very, very long time and fully engaged. Even in her illness this year, Fran has decided that she is determined to be here. So thank you, Fran, for being here. And to our guest speaker, Professor Thomas Frank, I just want to say again, welcome. It looks like you've had a very busy week so far, and I'm looking forward, as everyone is, to your talk this evening, and hopefully I'll get to be at least at one other tomorrow, but I hope that all of you have had the opportunity and your students to partake in this veritable pleasure of richness here that is this week. So Bob, and to your staff, and Nicole as well, thank you very much for helping to plan, and I think I did 4 sentences. Thank you very much.
Those were very generous sentences, Proustian even, I would say. We spend a lot of time trying to find just the right mixture of glory and willingness in the speakers. I mean, we once had a very famous person. Tomorrow we're going to have a Nobel Prize winner to talk with our speaker, but we once had a Nobel Prize winner who accepted the invitation, I won't tell you who it was, to be the Hess Scholar in Residence. But the negotiations were sort of like, well, let's say between the president of our country and the president of any one of a number of other countries nowadays. No matter what we did, he seemed to misunderstand and he seemed to object. And so I finally said very diplomatically, Mr. Nobel Prize winner, I do believe that we're laboring under a mutual misconstruction here. Why don't we just drop it? And we did. So to find someone as distinguished as our scholar in residence this year, who was also as open-minded, as generous, and let me say, as hardworking, as Thomas Frank, is a remarkable piece of good fortune. Thomas Frank is for some reason not quite as famous yet as he will be tomorrow or the day after, because he's been writing for a good long while, and he's been a columnist. He published a magazine called The Baffler, which still has many passionate, devoted fans, even in our faculty, people who have searched copies from old bookstores and who've read everything that he's written. I first encountered his writing about 11 years ago. He published a book called What's the Matter with Kansas, which freely being translated might mean what the hell happened in the 2000 election. How come all these poor people voted for the most obvious rich man's candidate that you could think of, a spoiled brat who didn't know how to do anything except lose money? By his CV anyway. Maybe he was a genius. Apparently he managed to graduate from Harvard Business School, and we know what that means. It was a puzzle. It was really a puzzle how all these people, he begins that book with a county in Kansas, which had an extremely high unemployment rate, and practically every index of misery that you can think of, they were champions of. And yet, in that election, they voted 80% for George Bush II. Now, why? He asked the question, how can people be brought to vote so directly against their own economic interests? Or as his sister-in-law put it, how can anyone vote for a Republican who ever worked for a boss? Which is a very elegant way of putting it. And the book is just a brilliant analysis of the kinds of cultural, what can we call it? I don't want to say skullduggery, only because it's not polite, but yes, skullduggery, that was engaged in to make ordinary people, poor people, unemployed people think that they should really protect the low tax rates on billionaires, because who knows, maybe someday, like Joe the plumber, they would get a plumbing license and a job and start a business and become billionaires themselves, and then they wouldn't want to pay these damn taxes. It's hard to understand, really is. But he made some kind of sense out of it. His books, there are quite a few of them. His books include also The Wrecking Crew, How Conservatives Rule, which is a book about what the Bush administration did once it was elected and reelected. Most recently, Pity the Billionaire, The Hard Times Swindle, and the Unlikely Comeback of the Right. Mr. Frank is not an academic, but he has a PhD in history from the University of Chicago. His dissertation was later published as The Conquest of Cool, which is sort of about how Madison Avenue made you think that if you once smoked a joint and dreamt of living on a commune, you could fulfill all of your hippie ambitions if you just bought a Rolex watch or a BMW or something. A lot of which went on, in the 70s and 80s and 90s. Very surprisingly, from 2008 to 2010, he was the, what can we say, the liberal in a cage on the Wall Street Journal's editorial page. It's a very interesting phenomenon. He's talked about it a lot to us this week. And he's published in many other places. He wrote a column for Harper's Magazine for a few years, and more recently, having decided that he wanted people to be able to read what he wrote, he decided to move his column to Salon.com, where you can read his column for free. Whereas at Harper's, you actually have to subscribe to the print thing. So they unload this slab of lumber into your mailbox every month. And a lot of people don't even open that slab of lumber, even after they've bought it. So he decided that he would do this. Let me say that even though he is not a professional professor, he is incredibly good at it. We had 15 separate events this week, of which this is the 12th. And not only did he show up on time for everything, which you wouldn't think means anything, but actually, among professors, it still counts, on time, prepared, sharp as a tack, witty, subtle. He doesn't simplify things unnecessarily. Students were just totally engaged. The rooms were full. And I don't think very many of them had even heard of him before. Because, as I say, for some reason, he's not as famous as he should be. Perhaps he's not courting the right lobbyists. I'm not sure. But one of his fans says that he is our H.L. Mencken. And I think it's actually pretty close to the truth. We feel enormously fortunate to have enticed him to come here to Brooklyn and to get him to work ever so much harder than I think he must have imagined we would expect. He's done a great job so far. And tomorrow, as you know, he's going to be having a public conversation with Paul Krugman around the corner in Whitman Auditorium, which ought to be a great moment to remember. So I could talk about him all night, and I'm sure you're thinking that I will. With no further ado, Thomas Frank.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
All right. So I was. Oh my God, that's a picture of me. I can't be. Come, please. How do I turn this off? Let's see. There it goes. So I'm gonna talk about creativity tonight. So I'm totally switching gears here. We're not going to talk about politics at all. Okay, we'll talk about politics a little bit. But those of you who came here expecting to hear me talk about politics, no. And it's when you say, why isn't he a professor? You're going to find out. I can alienate everybody. I alienate Republicans. I alienate Democrats. I alienate big business. I alienate everyone. So I want to start by telling you about a flash of creative insight that I had last year. Okay, and it started, as all such insights do, with a problem that I had. I'd been reading a lot of books, talking to people, and reading magazine articles, all of them telling me that the country and maybe mankind itself had wandered into a kind of creativity doldrums. Economic growth was slackening. The internet revolution wasn't as awesome as everybody thought it was going to be, and the forward march of innovation, which used to be a kind of cultural constant, had slowed to a crawl. And all of these different fields that used to generate lots of novelties, well, one of them in particular, financial engineering, back in the 90s anyway, used to generate lots of novelties, had come back to bite us. And in other departments, the country actually seemed to be going backwards. For example, you can no longer take a supersonic airliner across the Atlantic, the Concorde. They don't fly it anymore. We don't send astronauts to the moon anymore. Maybe it's passé. Maybe we can't afford it, but we don't do it. And I also knew that even as we were going backwards in some ways, there had been tremendous advances in our creativity promoting sector, right? You know about this. There are TED Talks on how to be a creative person. IBM would hold these innovation jams where IBM employees all over the world would brainstorm collectively. You can go to Walmart and get one of those thinking outside the box desk sculptures, you know. So if you listen to certain people, creativity is the story of our time, from the halls of MIT to the incubators of Silicon Valley. And I mean, the literature on this subject was enormous. Its authors include management gurus, you know, forever calling on us to slay the conventional, urban theorists with their celebrations of zesty togetherness, pop psychologists who are always giving us step-by-step instructions on how to unleash the inner Miles Davis, all this sort of thing. So I went out and got one of these books and sat down with it and tried to figure it all out. And the book I got was called Imagine: How Creativity Works. And this was a bestseller a couple years ago by a guy called, well, I should say an ex-wunderkind called Jonah Lehrer, whose resume, he was a Rhodes Scholar. He did a tour of duty at the New Yorker. He'd written a number of books about neuroscience and decision making. And things didn't end well for him. The book turned out to have a lot of made up facts in it. But I was, you know, I knew that, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna ignore it. I'm gonna tiptoe around that. That's not a problem for me. So I got a hot bath. You know, I drew a hot bath, well known for its power to trigger outside-the-box thoughts, and I opened my mind to the young master. And anecdote after heroic anecdote unfolded as creative minds did their nonlinear thing and came to epiphanies and found solutions. And I read about the invention of the Swifter, and I learned. You know, and I learned about how Bob Dylan achieved his great breakthrough and wrote that one song that they still play on the radio from time to time. And I found out that there was a company called 3M that had invented masking tape and the Post-it note and all sorts of other useful items. And I read about the cellist Yo-Yo Ma and about the glories of a company called Pixar. And that's when it hit me. I'd heard all this before. I mean, every single one of these stories seemed to unfold in an entirely predictable fashion. For example, I suspected that when Jonah Lehrer got around to Bob Dylan, he would talk about the song Like a Rolling Stone, and that's exactly what he did. And when it came to the 3M section, I waited for Lehrer to tell us about the invention of the Post-it note, and there it was. Now, what was going on here? Had I developed the gift of foresight? I mean, you know, sitting there in that really hot bath? No. I actually had heard all of these stories before. And if you spend a few minutes on Google, you'll find that the story of how Procter & Gamble invented the Swifter is a staple of marketing literature. It's repeated all the time. Bob Dylan is endlessly cited in studies of innovation, and you can read about his song Like a Rolling Stone and how he came up with it in the book The Fundamentals of Marketing, among many others. I mean, the story is told, and it's one of these oft-told tales, you know. As for 3M, I mean, this company has had this like decades-long standing O for them, going all the way back to Tom Peters' first book, In Search of Excellence, which is like one of the most influential management books of all time. And in fact, this story is so well known. I mean, the accidental invention of the Post-it note, I mean, is such a well-known story that the ignorance of people who don't know the story is actually one of the jokes. And do you remember this movie, Michelle and Romy's high school reunion? That's the running joke in the movie. One of them claims to have invented the Post-it note, and the other people at the reunion are like, "Are you sure?" Because we read about that in business school. That's in 1997. Anyhow, figuring all that out, that took a millisecond, right? But what I also understood sitting there in the bathtub was that the larger point, right, which is that the literature of creativity is a literature of surpassing banality. And every one of the creative books that I read, and I read a whole bunch of them for this, but every one of the books that I read seemed to boast the same shop-worn anecdotes and the same canonical heroes. It's always the same bunch of people: Einstein, Gandhi, Picasso, Dylan, Warhol, and of course the Beatles. And what does all this tell us? It's that those who are always encouraging us to think different almost never do so themselves. I mean, year after year, there's all installments in this unchanging genre are produced and consumed. And creativity, they tell us, is too important to be left to the creative. Our prosperity depends on it. And so by dint of careful study and the hardest kind of science, for example, by sliding a jazz pianist's head into an MRI machine while he plays a solo. By doing something like this, we can crack the code of creativity and unleash its money-making power, right? And that's always the lesson of this kind of literature. That's where the music and the theology and the physics and the ethereal, Monet water lilies are always supposed to direct us. Now, I've never seen a creativity book that tries to work the equation the other way around. For example, instructing jazz musicians how to solo by telling them the story of how somebody invented the slinky, something like that. That never happens. Now, why is this worth noticing, right? Who cares? Well, why should we care? For one thing, because we're talking about the literature of creativity, for Pete's sake. I mean, if there is a nonfiction genre from which we have a right to expect clever prose and uncanny insight, it should be this one. So why is it so consumed by formula and repetition? Why is that? And so this is, again, another uncanny bathtub insight. What I figured out is that the literature of creativity isn't about creativity in the first place. And while it reiterates this handful of well-known stories, favorite pop artists, favorite singers, favorite painters, favorite branding successes, it routinely ignores lots of other creative milestones that loom pretty large in the history of human civilization. I mean, for example, some of the most consistent innovators of the modern era were also some of its biggest monsters. I mean, let's be frank about that. Ooh, I shouldn't say that. Let's be upfront about that. Before I read this, I had been reading Gravity's Rainbow, the book by Thomas Pynchon, which is a highly creative book. And in that book, it's about a highly creative, although diabolical, event, which is the invention of the V-2 rocket by Nazi Germany. These people not only came with the V-2, jet fighter planes, assault rifles, all sorts of evil weapons, right? This is an evil regime and yet highly creative. And yet nobody wants to add Peenemünde, where the Germans developed the V-2 rocket. Nobody wants to add that to the list of creative hothouses like Periclean Athens and Renaissance Florence and current day Austin, Texas. Nobody wants to add that to the list. I mean, how much easier it is to tell us one more time how a jazz band works, or how someone came up with the idea for the slinky, or what shade of paint, when you apply it to the walls of your office, is most conducive to original thinking. So, go back to the same old stories. Now, I want to change gears here and tell you about a different way that our society uses the idea of creativity. And I want to tell you this story by talking about my hometown. Everything always goes back to Kansas with me. I grew up in Kansas City, which is mainly in Missouri, but part of it spills over into Kansas, and that's where I happened to grow up. And when I was a kid, my friends and I had a very predictable way of criticizing our hometown. And what was wrong with Kansas City? Well, we thought we knew back in those days. It was bland. It was orderly. It was predictable. And my friends and I would laugh at its, harmless theater productions and its pretentious suburbs and its very so private country clubs and its eternal taste for classic rock. By the way, I don't know if Brooklyn still suffers from this, but if you go back to Kansas and you're driving around, it's just like they're playing the same music they were 30 years ago. It's weird. My friends and I used to call it, the place that we grew up, we called it Cupcake Land, after a favorite essay that we had read back in the 80s. Kansas City knew nothing of the strong ideas of our robust generation, we thought. I mean, this place had no music subculture. It was deaf to irony. It was at war with its own past. And that was, I think, the sort of criticism that everybody made of their Midwestern hometowns back in those days. And I'll tell you what, those hometowns have really turned the tables on my friends and I nowadays. I mean, Kansas City fairly quivers with cultural vitality today. I mean, it is swarming with artists. Its traffic islands are bedecked with the colorful products of their studios. It has this beautiful new performing arts center designed by one of these spectacular new celebrity architects. It even has, every year, an indie rock festival to call its own. And all of these things were engineered for Kansas City by the very same group of civic leaders that my friends and I used to laugh at for their impotence and their cluelessness. And for example, at that Kansas City Indie Rock Festival that I mentioned, the mayor himself made a presentation a couple of years ago, which is like unthinkable for me and my stupid punk rock. You know, that would have never happened when I was a child. But today, yes, the mayor shows up at the punk rock festival, as do numerous local professionals and Chamber of Commerce types. Now, the word people use to describe how Kansas City has changed in recent years, they always use the same word, and the word is vibrant. Kansas City's vibrant now, and I'm sure your hometown is vibrant as well. In fact, every city is either vibrant these days or is working on a plan to become vibrant really soon. And the reason is simple, is because vibrant is what everybody wants in a city nowadays. Its desirability is so universal and so utterly beyond question that even though we aren't sure what the word vibrant means, we know it has to be cultivated, right? The vibrant, we believe, this is what makes certain cities succeed. The absence of vibrancy is what allows the diseases of depopulation and blight to set in. Now, the first time I heard this theory of vibrancy explained to me, I was like, no, that's all backwards. That's upside down. That's like saying that because the sidewalks get wet when it rains, we can encourage rain by, turning a hose on the sidewalks. That doesn't make any sense, right? But to, and that's what I thought, and in fact, that's still what I think. But to other people, this theory of the vibrant city is profoundly persuasive. And the pursuit of the vibrant is like the universal job description of our city's urban planners nowadays. And as it happens, it's also part of the Obama administration's economic recovery strategy for the nation. And we can I can talk about that later if you want to hear the details on it. It's actually true. But, everything I'm telling you is actually true, but it's like, there's the insane details. But this is why every place that you look nowadays is so goddamn vibrant. I mean, think about it. Akron, Ohio. Okay? Akron, Ohio was recently the subject of a conference that had the thrilling name Greater Akron. This is what vibrant looks like. Or Boise, Idaho. I just went by alphabetical order. Akron, Boise, Idaho, whose citizens, according to the city's Department of Arts and History, are fortunate to live in a vibrant community in which creativity flourishes in every season. Or Cincinnati, which is the home of a nonprofit called Go Vibrant, as well as the Greater Cincinnati Foundation, which hands out cultural vibrancy grants, guided by the knowledge that cultural vibrancy is vital to a thriving community. Is Rockford, I just started typing in names of places, that friends of mine came from. Is Rockford, Illinois vibrant? Oh my God, yes. According to a local news outlet, its mayor's art award nominees make Rockford vibrant. The Quad Cities. Anybody know what the Quad Cities are? It's in Iowa. Doesn't matter now, but it's are the Quad Cities vibrant? Oh, you bet. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, need you even ask? Pittsburgh is a kind of Athens of the vibrant, This is a city where dance parties and rock concerts enjoy the vigorous boosting of an outfit called Vibrant Pittsburgh. It's supposed to be a place that draws young people from across the nation in order to frolic in its numerous hip and vibrant neighborhoods, according to the blog maintained by Pittsburgh business organizations. Again, the Chamber of Commerce. So what does the word mean? What does vibrant mean? Well, it's easy enough to figure out what the chambers of commerce and the foundations mean by it. It's just our old friend creativity, only on a much larger scale. And vibrant is supposed to be this quality that you find in cities or neighborhoods where there's an art or music scene. They always use the same word. They use scene, the word scene. There's always lots of, by the way, this is going to start to sound really familiar to Brooklynites, to the people of Brooklyn. But there's the scene, there's the restaurants, and there's always lots of food markets of this certain highbrow, authentic type. There's lots of Frank Gehry architecture, Frank Gehry style architecture, to memorialize the scene's transient life. And there's this audience of prosperous people who are interested in all of these things. And we also know how vibrancy is supposed to work. This is the ultimate effect of vibrancy, right? The economic effects that we want it to bring. We know that art production is supposed to be linked through the black box of vibrancy to prosperity. Okay, so you go from one to the other, and this is something so simple that one of the vibrancy proponents I was reading had a flow chart to illustrate how it works. Step 1, artists move in. Skip a couple here. Step 5, neighborhood develops cool reputation. Step 6, property values go up. Right? That's always the way it goes. And this is supposed to be something so obvious that everyone concerned agrees on it. Okay? The Atlantic magazine had a story about the burgeoning vibrancy of Kansas City. It had this line in it. Corporations see a vibrant cultural landscape as a magnet for talent, almost as vital as for drawing good workers as more traditional benefits like retirement plans and health insurance. So there's like authentic farmers markets, it's a substitute for health insurance. And so when the Cincinnati Foundation that calls itself Arts Wave informs the world that the arts create vibrant neighborhoods and contribute to a thriving economy, they are voicing a sentiment that is so commonplace in foundation land that it's basically not even worth remarking on. But so how does art do these amazing things? How does art pull this off? Well, reasoning backward from the ultimate object of all civic planning, which is, we all know what that is, right? Attracting and retaining top talent. The art place is part of the National Endowment for the Arts. Their website announces like this: the ability to attract and retain talent depends in part on quality of place, and the best proxy for quality of place is vibrancy. You see how it all goes around? It's like a dog chasing its tail, and but it works, right? So how does it work? Well, one way that vibrancy builds prosperity is by mobilizing art people as a sort of vibrancy shock troops, and then counting on them to, and you know the word here, gentrify formerly bedraggled parts of town. And after that, you have other vibrancy multipliers that kick in, right? The presence of hipsters is supposed to be inspirational to businesses, and their doings are supposed to make cities interesting and attractive to that class of professionals that everybody wants, right? And their colorful japes help local companies attract quality employees and so on. So all that a city really needs to prosper these days is a group of art school grads and some lofts for them to live in, and a couple of thrift stores to supply them with the ironic clothes that they crave, like this. And then we just step back and I'm quite serious about that. It's all thrifted. And then we just step back and watch them work their magic. Now, the connection with government and foundations obviously reminded me of the last time our country subsidized the arts, in a really serious way, and that was, in the 1930s with the WPA, which we've been talking about quite a bit this week. And both then and today, we heard a lot about scenes. Remember, the public art in the 1930s was very much concerned with the American scene. They had that style known as regionalism, and so you had people like Thomas Hart Benton, who painted Missouri scenes, and John Stuart Curry painted Kansas scenes. And you had unemployed authors who were hired to write tour guides to every state in the country. But in today's more vibrant version, the artist himself is the spectacle, the subject of the tour guide. Okay, we don't write the tour guides, we are the subject of the tour guides. And the artist's primary job isn't really to produce art, but to participate in a scene, in this kind of act that we're supposed to put on for well-heeled spectators. Indeed, this act is essential to vibrancy. In order to bring the economic effects that the arts are being counted on to bring, remember, attracting and retaining top talent for cities, corporations, that's always what it comes back to. In order for that to happen, the artist has to be highly visible. He has to run a gallery, patronize cool coffee shops and restaurants, has to rehab rundown buildings. That has to be spectacular. It has to be very visible. So vibrancy is a kind of performance that artists and musicians are expected to put on, either directly or indirectly, for the corporate class. That's the audience. These are the ones we're supposed to reassure of our city's vibrancy so that they never, choose to move their operations to some more vibrant burg across a state line somewhere. So an artist who, say, keeps to herself, who works in her room all day, who wears unremarkable clothes and goes without tattoos, by definition, such an artist brings nothing to this project and adds little to the economic chances of a given area. She inspires nobody. She offers no lessons in creativity, not vibrant, not remunerative, not investment grade. Okay? So, on the surface, vibrancy theory reveres the artist, but in reality, it doesn't have very much to say about people who would actually take artistic production seriously. I mean, you think again about the public art of the 1930s, and it was heavy-handed stuff, right? Almost to the point of being propaganda. But it was also really, really concerned with the lives of ordinary people. The art of the vibrant, on the other hand, would separate the artist from, such boring souls. I mean, the creative ones today are supposed to be segregated in a scene, which it is their job to make vibrant and thus pump up real estate prices, inspire creative class onlookers, attract and retain top talent, all that sort of thing. But what about the people that nobody's interested in attracting and retaining? I mean, think about this. Hundreds of millions of Americans go through their lives in places that aren't vibrant and in areas that don't have a scene, and jobs that aren't rewarding, and industries that aren't creative. And these people's experiences are almost, by definition now, off limits for artistic contemplation. So instead of all that, what the aesthetic of the vibrant proposes this kind of tail-chasing reverence for creativity itself. We always come back to the C word, creativity itself. I want to talk about the trophy buildings for a second, the trophy architecture. That's always the greatest expression of vibrancy theory, and it always comes back to Frank Gehry. It's always seriously, it's always these Frank Gehry style buildings that every city council lusts for, and they seem to think that that's what they have to build as a kind of, that's the welcome mat we have to build for the creative class. I mean, what is it about Gehry? He's this sort of archetypal genius of this age of creativity worship. For the management gurus of the world, if you guys were here this morning, you saw my lecture. I actually showed some slides I showed a slide of a new management school. Not new, it was built in the late 90s. A management school being built in Cleveland, designed by Frank Gehry, with the swoopy titanium curves and everything. And for management gurus have a special fondness for Frank Gehry architecture. For them, he is this kind of living, breathing symbol of creativity and originality. And it doesn't make really any difference for them how Gehry's work diverges from the, box-like corporate structure of the old days. It's just that it does diverge, right? That it's not some soulless glass and steel box that incorporates all these wacky building materials and irregular angles. And in those wacky materials and those irregular angles, the management gurus find this affirmation of their entire worldview, right? Entrepreneurship instead of top-down bureaucracy, disruption instead of stability. They love that word, disruption. The chaos of free markets instead of regulation, labor flexibility instead of job security. There's actually another, to get back to the literature of creativity, there's a book that I read back in 2002 called New Ideas About New Ideas. I'm telling you, this literature is enormous. You could read it for weeks and weeks and weeks. And in this, it's, the argument is that, as they put it, innovation is the only way to a better time. Innovation can only come from organizations that are hot, hip, and happening. The artist is more valued than the manager, and all this stuff. And of course, Frank Gehry is then, focused on as the man who stands above all others. Now let's see, where are we? I'm going to skip the part about Enron. But what strikes me about all this is Frank Gehry, as the preeminent architect of our time, with his trademark, the computer-assisted curves, the swooping titanium corners and everything. It represents the kind of religion of entrepreneurial creativity in the same way that you think about Stanford White, the Beaux-Arts style in the 1890s, radiated imperial grandeur, or the way that the office blocks of Skidmore, Owings Merrill back in the 60s and 70s symbolized efficiency, right? So this is the symbol of our time. This is the reason that Gehry liked curves and box-breaking protuberances grace the offices of the hippest ad agencies and the hottest tech firms. And, of course, that prestigious business school in Cleveland that I was talking about earlier. Now, I want to conclude by talking about a different bathtub and a different insight. This one was back in 2002. And it was a bathtub in the south side of Chicago where I lived at the time, and where the trains would go by outside my window in this all-day, din of clanks and squeaks. And while I was sitting there in the bathtub, I was reading a different book about creativity. I read a lot of this stuff. And this one was Richard Florida's book, The Rise of the Creative Class, which was a very big deal at the time in 2002. Florida's argument went like this. He said creativity was the most valuable quality of all. He said it was the decisive source of competitive advantage today. This made creative people into what he called society's dominant class. And companies that wanted to harness their power would need to follow these people wherever they went. Therefore, Florida reasoned, cities and states were obliged to reconfigure themselves as havens for people of nonconformist taste, who would then generate civic coolness with art zones and music scenes and truckloads of authenticity. This is before the word vibrant became such a cliche, so he didn't use it that much. But Richard Florida, in this book about the rise of the creative class, he even invented what he called a Bohemian Index, which he claimed revealed a strong correlation between the presence of artists and economic growth. I love that, a Bohemian Index. I'm sitting there in the bathtub, and every aspect of this argument just pissed me off. It made me so angry. It infuriated me. Was this guy suggesting planned bohemias, I wondered, built by governments to attract businesses? I mean, everything about it rubbed me the wrong way back in those innocent days. And this is 2002, and like I say, back in those days, I used to spend pretty much all of my time with the kind of people who fit Richard Florida's definition of the creative class: writers, musicians, intellectuals, that kind of people. And here's this author, Richard Florida, he seems to be suggesting that such people were valuable mainly for their contribution to this kind of countercultural pantomime that was supposed to lure or inspire business executives. You can see this drove me crazy, but what really infuriated me was the author's assumption that creativity was a thing our society really valued. I mean, in truth, I'd been hearing this all my life since kindergarten, back in, the found creativity valuable. I believed that in the way that older generations believed in, the beneficence of government or the blessings of providence, right? I believed in creativity. And yet now, I was in my 30s by then, and I looked around at my creative friends, and when you thought about them as a group, when you considered my creative friends as a group, these were people who were obviously on their way down, not up. My generation of PhDs wound up as low-paid adjuncts, terrified to annoy their superiors. My friends who were artists, the institutions that made their lives possible, newspapers, magazines, record labels, were right then entering a period of disastrous decline, and everybody could see it. I mean, the creative world as I knew it was not flowering at all. It was dying. And when I thought about my creative friends as individuals, the literature of creativity began to seem even more perverse. I mean, even then, in 2002, I was old enough to know that for all of its reverential talk about the rebel and the box breaker, society had no interest in new ideas at all, unless they reinforced favorite theories or could be monetized in some obvious way, like inventing the Swifter or whatever it is, the Slinky. And I mean, the method of every triumphant intellectual movement that I knew of had been to quash dissent and cordon off truly inventive voices. That was just how debate was conducted. Authors rejoiced at the discrediting of their rivals, and academic professions. I was at the University of Chicago at the time, where I had recently got a PhD. I was living in the neighborhood still. But you think about the University of Chicago economics department and the way they would exclude people who didn't toe the party line. That's how you win the argument, by drawing some kind of professional line. Leftist cliques would go around excommunicating one another. Liberals would ignore any suggestion that didn't encourage or vindicate their great move to the center. And conservatives seemed to be at war with the very idea of human intelligence. or so I thought as I looked around me in the year 2002. Now, later on, after much trial and error, many bathtubs later, I would understand that there really was something deeply insightful about Richard Florida's book. And the insight that he had that I think was valuable is the idea that creativity was the attribute of a class, okay? A class that Florida identified not only with intellectuals and artists, but also with this broad swath of the professional managerial spectrum, okay? So the creative class isn't just artists and academics and scholars and painters, musicians. No, it's these other people too, okay? Lawyers, doctors, business managers, management gurus, all that sort of thing. It would take me years to understand that that's what he was up to in the book. And when then I finally got it all at once. Of course, it all comes to you in a rush. And the reason that these, I figured it out, the reason that all of these optimistic books had so little to do with the actual lives of creative people, the downward spiraling lives of creative people, the reason the books had nothing to do with that is because these books weren't about those people in the first place, okay? The literature of creativity was something completely different. And everything that I have described so far is a clue, the cliches, the constantly repeated examples, the failure to appreciate what's actually happening to creative people. This isn't science. This is a literature of superstition in which everything always works out and the good guys always triumph and the right inventions always come along just in the nick of time. There's even a creativity book called Where Good Ideas Come From, in which the creative epiphany is a kind of heroic character itself. The creative epiphany rides to the rescue, helping out clueless humanity whenever necessary. This is a quote from it. Good ideas may not want to be free, but they do want to connect, fuse, and recombine. These are ideas now, they want to reinvent themselves by crossing conceptual borders. They want to complete each other as much as they want to compete. And what is you think about this now, what is the true object of this kind of superstitious literature? The final clue. came from a book about creativity by a man called Mihaly, and I'm going to pronounce his name wrong. It's Csikszentmihalyi. Okay, do you know who this is? He wrote a famous book called Flow. And then he wrote another book about creativity in which he acknowledges that far from being an act of individual inspiration, what we call creativity is merely an expression of professional consensus. Okay? And he uses Vincent van Gogh. This is actually really telling. He uses Vincent van Gogh as an example, and he says that Vincent van Gogh's creativity came into being when a sufficient number of art experts felt that his paintings had something important to contribute to the domain of art. So it's not Van Gogh himself, it's the experts who judge Van Gogh and decide in the consensus of their professional, in the fullness of their professional wisdom, that he's in fact creative. So innovation only exists when the correctly credentialed hive mind agrees that it does. And without such a response, the author whose name I can't pronounce continues, Van Gogh would have remained what he was, a disturbed man who painted strange canvases. So what determines creativity, in other words, is the very thing that it's supposed to be rebelling against, established expertise. Okay, one more time. Consider the narrative chain that makes up this literature that I've been describing. It's the story of brilliant people in the arts and humanities who are studied by other brilliant people, usually in the sciences or finance or marketing. And then the readership of this literature is made up of us, members of the professional managerial class, each of whom harbors a pretty strong suspicion that he or she is pretty damn brilliant as well. And so what I eventually realized about this narrative chain is that the real subject of the literature is the reader, the professional managerial audience itself. These people who think they hear clear, sweet reason when they turn on NPR and think they're in the presence of something really profound when they watch a billionaire give a TED talk, you know. And by the way, I proposed this talk as a TED talk. Someone was asking me why I never give a TED talk. Now you know why. And what this complacent literature purrs into the ears of the professional managerial class is that the creative class is that creativity is their property, their competitive advantage in the world, their class virtue, if you will. So creativity is what they bring to the national economic effort, these books tell them. And it's also the benevolent doctrine under which they rightly rule the world. Thank you very much. Okay. So that's my would-be TED Talk. And so I wrote a big part of that for Harper's Magazine, and as part of the joke, we submitted it for a TED Talk. They have to choose you, and we thought that would be funny, but no, of course they never did. Somehow, they weren't interested in hearing that. But do y'all have any questions? Yes. And thank you for taking notes, by the way. That's very flattering. I like to see that.
You know, I write out loud about this subject, and I'm very happy that I'm here. I thought it was a great lecture. But I have a question. So commenting on this commoditization of creativity and bohemian uniformity, I guess you would call it, I think it's difficult to differentiate what's actual creative innovation versus what's completely contrived by the establishment. And I would argue it's just going to become more difficult for an audience. So do you fear that, I guess, our critical eye for aesthetics and writing will eventually just be diminished completely?
Do I think that creative writing will be diminished?
No, that our critical eye.
Oh, our critical eye. Sorry.
Writing will be diminished eventually as time progresses.
Well, you know, you'd think, I'm of two minds about this, because, I'm a pessimist. I'm a total born pessimist. And so, of course I think that. But on the other hand, I mean, think about what the internet is and the way we talk on the internet. Everybody is super, super critical. Everybody's constantly tearing everybody else down and criticizing their stars, and then criticizing the people who criticize the stars, but it's also really shallow. And also, I'll tell you something else. So today I've given 2 lectures about these very banal forms of literature that are read by very powerful people. Earlier today I talked about management literature and like what would you call personal finance advice books from the 1990s, and then this stuff. And these are all books that are written and read by very powerful people. You know, advice on how to manage your workforce, or in this case, advice on how to run a city. For Pete's sake, this is like big stuff. It's almost never criticized. There is no real format or no real space in which to do that kind of criticism. You know, like my experience with the TED people. Well, there was no experience. I just never heard from them again. Nobody's really interested in doing that. And I'm surprised by that. You know, for me, this is like when I first stumbled across the word vibrancy and saw it everywhere. I was like, oh, I'm in a target-rich environment. You know, this is going to be fun. This is a regular shooting gallery. You know, but that's you know, for whatever reason, I had that playground all to myself. To mix metaphors, I had that playground all to myself. So I don't know. You know, I'm of 2 minds about this whole thing. On the one hand, yes. On the other hand, no. I'm sorry, that's not a good answer. That's not a good answer. Yeah.
I was wondering if you've ever read Who Moved My Cheese?
You're teasing. That was the lecture this morning.
Because I've heard a lot about it. I'm an entrepreneur myself.
Uh-huh.
I've had a business since I was 16. I'm 22 now. And I like reading a lot of these weird business books. And I was wondering, is it good? Like, should I really read it?
Who Moved My Cheese? You want to stay away from that. That is some smelly cheese. Let me well, that's my take. Shall I tell you what it's about? Okay, so Who Moved My Cheese? What does it mean? So the idea of the book is it's about workers. He calls them little people. And they're mice. They're essentially mice in a maze. And they get up every morning and they run to where their cheese is, which is their work. And you know, and that's it. And then one day they get up and run to where their cheese is, and it's not there. And there's 2 little people, and one of them goes off looking for his cheese. It must be around here somewhere, and he discovers how fulfilling this is, the searching for his cheese and all that. But the other one kicks and screams and complains. And the book tells us that this is the guy who's screaming, "Who moved my cheese?" is you know, this is the wrong thing to do. This is the wrong reaction. In fact, someone who does something like that should get fired. And I'm paraphrasing, you know, I'm shortening in all sorts of ways, but that's roughly what it tells us. And then the last 50 pages of the book are how you can buy mass, you know, copies of huge numbers of this book and use it in your workplace to make workers stop complaining.
Are there any books that you'd recommend me reading?
About entrepreneurship? Oh man, you see, the thing is, so much of this literature is really bogus. But if you know, I mean, it's all, and it's also stuff that you're once you read the first one and you've read them all. You know, they all have the same insight and the same take on everything. I would say, you know, expose yourself to creativity itself if you're interested in that. You know, geez, I don't know. Listen to classic rock all the time. No.
Sorry, I have a lot of questions. Do you think it's smart for me to go to small, little, non-vibrant places and set up shop over there?
I have no idea. What do you mean, like Iowa?
Yeah.
Look, I'll say one thing about the Midwest. Okay, we used to have a saying in my creative days when I ran a literary magazine. And look, in some ways I'm kind of like the villain of this story. Not the villain. I was the one who was the artist that didn't have the tattoos and works in his room and doesn't wear, you know, conspicuously hip clothing and all that sort of thing. And my friends and I had a wonderful time doing this. We were really doing art. Well, we were doing a literary magazine, and it was a blast. And we lived, everything was secondhand, and we lived in the south side of Chicago, and the rent was cheap, and it was a great time. We had a saying: the secret to happiness is low overhead. Now, I don't know about entrepreneurship, but New York City, this is the highest overhead you can find in America. You know, that's one great thing about where I come from, Kansas City, Chicago, the Midwest. Man, it's like, the rent is like the cheapest in the world, or in the country anyway. It's very affordable to live in other places. But I'm sorry, I'm getting away from, you know, I don't know what to tell you. I'm sorry, I'm no good at this. But somebody had a question over here.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting you talked about the 1930s and the WPA, that the creative element was the work itself, and now that it's sort of the artists themselves as performer, and you know, as much as they're sort of chastising the internet, it seems like the internet opens up opportunities for the work to come back to the work itself being the focus of attention, because people don't have to rely on some corporation to build a big art center in order to get that.
That's right, but you'd be surprised at how the sort of gallery culture survives. I've wondered about that as well. The aura of the thing itself is like greater than ever. Just look at the prices that are being paid. You know, that we're forever setting records for the certain kind of objet d'art, right? Where, like, if it's a Monet, you know. Did you see the story in the paper the other day about the who's the English artist that had these pastoral scenes, and they Constable, and somebody had something that they thought was a copy of a Constable, turned out to be a genuine Constable, and it went for some incredible amount of money. And there was a brilliant article in Harper's a while ago, not by me. This is one I really wish I had the idea and written it. It was a history of forgery, and of of people tricking each other with fake. Well, anyhow, the whole concept of fake masterpieces has is really intriguing to me, because for whatever reason, there's a perfect example, but there was some forgery somewhere, and it was indistinguishable from the original, and it was like abstract art, right? So the problem with abstract art is that there's lots of forgery of it. And so my question was, they eventually discovered it was a forgery and it was hanging in some prestigious art gallery somewhere, and they took it down. So I was wondering, but did it give the same pleasure, right, as the real things? Is there a way to quantify that? And for whatever reason, we are more obsessed with the real object than ever before, I think. So yes, the internet does open up all sorts of things. Yes?
The thing is, there will eventually be a museum of successful forgeries. And we will
forgeries that give pleasure.
That are vibrant. We thank you again.